sometimes with Europeans, sometimes even with American passports, who have been radicalized. How to counter this? How to reverse it? Maajid Nawaz was himself a radical jihadi. Now, as the founder of the counter-extremism group Quilliam, Nawaz works to promote tolerance and democracy among Muslim youth. Maajid, when you hear about these people in Paris, and let us assume that some of them, we don't know how many, are in fact locals, paint us a picture of the kind of person who would do this. It's still so unthinkable, not just being willing to kill, but being willing to die.
Yes, thank you, Fareed. I want to begin by saying that, look, I deal with this every single day of my life. This struggle, this cause has consumed me since founding Quilliam 8 years ago. So I just want to make it very clear that between the apologism of the far left in this debate, pretending there's absolutely no problem with Europe's Muslims, and between the sensationalism of the far right, the most important thing, as you've correctly stated right now, for us is for us to remain level-headed. The vast majority of those who have gone to join ISIS from the West, Western-born and raised Muslims, are Western citizens. So yes, there are genuine discussions around refugees. We need to be having genuine conversations about some of the challenges that refugees pose. But look, let's be honest and real about this. Germany has taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees. France has hardly taken in any. Yet I bet you that many of these attackers in France were French-born and raised citizens. So let's remain level-headed and avoid being, I'd say, blinded by our left eye or popping a blood vessel in our right eye, because both of those conclusions would render us blind.
And tell us about those, let's assume you're right. Tell us about these French youth. You've interviewed hundreds of these kinds of people. Why are they willing to commit suicide for a cause they often barely understand, as far as I can tell?
So I would argue that jihadist extremism, we're in the midst of a fully blown global jihadist insurgency, and jihadist extremism is the new zeitgeist of the anti-establishment angry youth. Many even convert to Islam to join them, and a few factors come into play here when they're joining this phenomenon. One of them is a sense of a grievance or anger, a perceived sense, ultimately, of grievance and anger. Another is an identity crisis, and in the case of France, we all hear about the suburbs on the edges of Paris and how difficult it's been for the French to fix this question. The same applies, by the way, to Britain and across much of Europe, to fix what I call the Muslim question, the successful integration of those Muslims who are born and raised in Europe, and finding a place, which is a two-way street. It's a mutual process of integration. Finding a place for them in European society is a huge challenge. And the final factor I'd add in here is the role that the ideological narrative plays. I call that ideology Islamist extremism, as distinct from the religion of Islam, and the way in which that ideology blinkers these angry young men and women from seeing any form of moral clarity and being prepared to commit all forms of atrocities in its name.
When you got radicalized yourself, what was the principal motive for you?
The principal motive in my case, I joined a group known as Hizb ut-Tahrir at the age of 16. It's the first group that was responsible for popularizing this notion of resurrecting a caliphate. And at 16, there were two things that really disturbed me. One was the genocide that was unfolding in Bosnia against Muslims on our own continent of Europe, which made me feel completely disconnected from mainstream society, because, of course, the reaction in dealing with that genocide was incredibly slow, and many Bosnian Muslims lost their lives in that genocide. And the second was domestic racism, which I faced. But I want to emphasize here that those two were as perceived by me as a 16-year-old. Of course, they don't justify joining a theocratic organization. So what kicked in after that sense of grievance was the fact that I was found in that incredibly vulnerable state and sold this ideological narrative. And in fact, it's this latter point, the ideological narrative, that we need to be a lot more robust in dealing with. We have to recognize we cannot shoot our way out of this problem. We are in the midst of a global jihadist insurgency, and we have to render the appeal of this Islamist ideology, as unattractive as Soviet communism has now become for young people today.
Do you find finally that you can reverse it when you talk to these young people? What works best in deprogramming them?
The most inefficient way to go about this is to try and pull people out once they've joined. Unfortunately, it's incredibly difficult. I'm not, my pattern isn't normal. I was a political prisoner in Egypt, and most of those whom I served with are either at the same level of their theocratic convictions, or even more, even more committed to the notion of resurrecting a caliphate. I think the most efficient way to approach this is to prevent the next generation of youth from succumbing to this phenomenon of Islamist extremism, and that would mean working to build resilience among communities. And crucially, it's not just a Muslim problem, it's not just a non-Muslim problem. I give the analogy of racism, Fareed. You don't have to be African American to challenge racism. Anyone who cares about this issue, it's all of our problems, because that bomb, when it goes off, all of us get affected by it. So we all have to show solidarity, including Muslims across the world, have to show the solidarity we expect from others when it comes to racism and anti-Muslim attacks. We show in this instance, and we all have to stand together. The worst thing we can do right now is think and act like ISIS by dividing people along religious lines.
Very quickly, do you think the tide is turning? Where are we in this struggle?
Unfortunately, I think that this is the new normal. We're going to have many more such attacks. In fact, we're overdue an attack in Britain, and God forbid, I shudder to think if that were to happen. So I think this is the new normal, and we're not turning the tide at the moment, but what we are turning the tide on in particular is in understanding and getting to grips with this. David Cameron, the Prime Minister here, has been speaking openly for once, and finally actually this year, about the threat that the